Welcome to GolfCask Original Series, The Blend. Perfect for golf and whiskey enthusiasts alike. Hey there, GolfCask Nation. This is Brian Bailie here, bringing you a new episode of The Blend, the perfect blending of golf and whiskey. This episode is going to be a little different. I'm actually going to separate. We're going to do whiskey-centric this week, golf-centric next week. And the reason why is this was really driven by questions at a whiskey tasting I did at my house a few nights back with the UVA data science team. My team is working on a super secret data science project for GolfCask, and you'll learn more about that in the coming days and weeks ahead. But the number one question, other than how to taste, how to actually go through the process of a tasting, they really wanted to learn more about how whiskey was made. So I spent a lot of time answering those questions. So I really thought about it. I go, hey, why haven't I not made a podcast of this as of yet? So here we go. I do have a special co-host with me today. It is Old Elk, a wheated bourbon. I'm not the hugest wheated bourbon fan, but when we had a tasting, one of the kids wanted to try a wheated bourbon, and I went ahead and said, pick a bottle. They had Weller's, they had Old Elk, they had Nulu, they had Maker's Mark, Cash Strength, Private Selection. They had a lot to choose from, but they chose Old Elk. Why? I think they like the shape of the bottle. And so without further ado, I have Old Elk here as my guest host. And again, I'm not the biggest whiskey or the wheated whiskey fan, but by the nose, wheated whiskey gives me that kind of bready, sourdough kind of it. The wheated part really floored me in the beginning, but now I'm starting to really appreciate it. Like I said, I used to not like wheated whiskeys, but I'm really starting to appreciate them. Go figure. So, Old Elk, cheers. That's pretty good. Nose is very sweet. Kind of get that bread flavor. It's very sweet on the taste, but very subtle, very rounded, nothing harsh. Lingers around, a little ethanol, a little dry hang around, but it's still hanging around. Buttery sweet, like butter, sugar, spectacular. Even a little spice in the background. Not what I expect from the normal wheated bourbon, so Old Elk, tip of the cap to you on this one. You'll be making some surprise appearances throughout this podcast. So let's dive in here and let's start to figure out how whiskey is made. Whiskey is a spirit steeped in history and tradition and craftsmanship. For centuries, the golden liquid has traveled through time, from grain to glass, weaving a story of dedication, precision, and patience. But how does raw grain transform into a smooth pour we enjoy today? Let's take a journey through the process of whiskey. First, we got to find a grain. Every great whiskey begins in the field. With the choice of grain, whiskey can be made from a variety of different grains, but the most common use barley, corn, rye, and wheat. Each of these grains bring its own unique set of characteristics and flavors that shape the personality of whiskey. Barley is perhaps the most famous grain for whiskey, particularly in Scotch whiskeys as well as Irish whiskeys. Barley contributes to a complex maltiness and depth of flavor. In many single malt Scotch whiskeys, 100% malted barley is used, resulting in a rich, layered flavor ranging from cereal notes to fruit and spice. The malting process, where barley is soaked, germinated, and then dried, also develops enzymes that help break down the starches in the grain into fermentable sugars. Corn, on the other hand, is the backbone of bourbon. To be legally classified as a bourbon, the mash must contain at least 51% corn. Corn imparts sweetness, which gives the bourbon its characteristic flavor profile. Notes of honey, caramel, vanilla are often present. The higher percentage of corn, the sweeter and the softer the whiskey tends to be. Rye. I'm a rye guy. Rye is known for its bold, spicy characteristics. I like a whiskey that will fight back. Rye whiskey, especially popular in Canada and the United States, is often described as having a peppery, dry, and slightly herbal quality. Rye can add complexity to a whiskey blended or stand strong on its own, offering a sharper, more intense drinking experience. Wheat. Old Elk, thank you. Wheat, while less commonly used as a dominant grain, it is essential in some types of whiskeys, particularly wheated bourbons like Maker's Mark, Weller, Pappy. Wheat brings a softness and a smoothness to the whiskey, toning down the sharper edges of the other grains and allowing a more subtle flavor to emerge, like bread dough and maybe even light floral notes. The selection and balance of these grains are often referred to as a mash bill. are carefully chosen by the distiller to craft the desired flavor profile. Once harvested, the grains are cleaned and stored before being sent to the mill, where they'll be ground into a grist to begin the whiskey making process. So now we're going to go learn about the mash. When the grains are selected and milled to a grist, the next step is called mashing, a crucial part that breaks down the complex carbohydrates in the grains into fermentable sugars, which are needed to create alcohol. The milled grain is added to a large vessel called a mash tun, and the hot water is slowly added in 3 stages. The water is typically added at the first stage at a lower temperature, between 140 and 150 degrees Fahrenheit, and gradually increases in heat. The progression of heat helps extract maximum amounts of fermentable sugars from the grain without scorching the mash. We don't want burned mash. Will destroy the whiskey. As the grain is mixed with the water, enzymes that were active during the malting break down the starches into simple sugars such as maltose. This process is known as saccharification. The mash is carefully stirred to ensure that every grain is exposed to water, creating a thick porridge-like mixture. If you've ever been on a distillery tour, you know when you've seen the mash. After mashing is complete, the liquid portion called the wort is drained from the mash tun. The sugary liquid is essential for the next step in whiskey making, fermentation. However, to maximize efficiency, the remaining grains are washed with additional hot water to extract any remaining sugar in the process called sparging. The leftover grain husks, now devoid of most of their sugars, are typically removed from the mash and are often reused as animal feed. This creates a sustainable, waste-free process. The wort, now rich with fermentable sugars, is cooled down and prepared for fermentation. This cooling is vital because yeast, used in the next step, needs a specific temperature range to thrive. At this point, the wort has the essential sugars needed to produce alcohol during fermentation, but is still far from becoming a whiskey. Some distillers use a process known as sour mash at this stage. This involves adding a portion of leftover mash from a previous batch into the new mash. Much like sourdough bread, the sour mash method helps maintain consistency of flavor, pH balance, and fermentation quality across multiple batches of whiskey. Sour mash, commonly used in the bourbon production, ensures balance and stable environment for the yeast during fermentation, leading to a more consistent final product. Afterward, the wort is ready for fermentation, where it will be transformed into something with real potency. Now the real power broker, yeast. Let's talk fermentation. Next, the wort is transferred into a fermentation vessel that can either be wood or stainless steel, depending on the distiller's preference. This is where one of the most crucial steps in whiskey making begins, fermentation. Yeast, a single-celled organism, is added to the wort. This yeast consumes the sugars in the wort, converting them into alcohol and carbon dioxide. This is a natural process, but it is carefully controlled by the distiller. The yeast not only produces alcohol, but it also generates a variety of flavor compounds known as esters, aldehydes, and phenols. These compounds contribute to fruity, floral, and sometimes spicy notes that give your whiskey its complexity. Different strains of yeast can produce different flavors, and the length of fermentation affects the final characteristics of your whiskey. Typically, fermentation lasts 48 to 96 hours, though some distilleries opt for longer times to exact more flavors. Fermentation is a balancing act. Too short, the whiskey may lack depth. Too long, and unwanted flavors might develop. Temperature is crucial as well. Fermenting at too high of a temperature can kill the yeast and cause off flavors, while too low a temperature slows down the process, reducing the alcohol yield. When fermentation is complete, the liquid in the tank is known as a wash, and it now contains anywhere from 6 to 10% alcohol by volume. It is the building block for what will eventually become whiskey, but it still needs to go through more distillation to concentrate the alcohol and refine its flavors. Now comes the transformation that truly defines whiskey, distillation. This process involves heating wash to separate alcohol from water and other components. Distillation is traditionally carried out in a large copper pots, but can also be going through continuous stills. Copper plays a vital role that it helps remove sulfur compounds that would otherwise impart undesirable flavors to the whiskey. The first step in distillation is heating the wash in a wash still. As the liquid heats, alcohol, being more volatile than water, evaporates. These alcohol vapors rise up through the neck of the still and they are condensed back into liquid form. The first liquid that comes off the still is known as foreshots or heads. These contains methanol and other compounds that can be harmful or deadly and can even make you blind and also taste unpleasant. Distillers discard these foreshots. Next, the middle cut, also known as the hearts, is collected. This is high quality alcohol that will become your whiskey. This cut is rich in flavor and has the right balance of alcohol and congeners and chemical compounds that will give whiskey your depth and complexity. The distiller's skill here is key. They must decide when to stop collecting the hearts and switch to tails, the final part of the distillation. Tails are lower in alcohol and often contain heavier, oilier compounds that can affect the flavor negatively. These tails are either discarded or recycled into the next batch to ensure no potential is wasted. For most whiskeys, the liquid is typically distilled twice. The first distillation occurs in the wash still where the alcohol comes out anywhere from 25 to 35% alcohol. The second distillation occurs in a smaller still called a spirit still, where the alcohol is concentrated further, reaching anywhere from 60 to 70% alcohol. Some Irish whiskeys go through a third distillation process, resulting in a lighter, smoother spirit. In many distilleries, the distiller uses the spirit safe, a glass and brass apparatus that can monitor and control the flow of distillant without physically having to touch it. This allows them to make precise cuts between the heads, hearts, and tails, ensuring that the best part of the spirit is kept for aging. And when we talk aging, we're talking maturation. Once distilled, the whiskey enters its longest phase, called maturation. The clear, raw spirit, often referred to as new make or white dog. Yes, the spirit that comes out of the still is clear. Your whiskey is brown. How does this happen? Maturation. This is poured into oak barrels. The choice of wood is essential. Most distilleries use American white oak, known for its imparting flavors of vanilla, caramel, and spice, while European oak barrels are often used for aging sherry, lend to richer, dried fruit and nuttier notes. Before the whiskey is poured in, the barrel must be treated, toasted, or charred. The process breaks down the wood's natural sugars, creating a layer of caramelized flavors that will slowly steep into your whiskey over time. Also acts as a filter. The level of char can vary from a very light toast to a deep char known as alligator char because of the crackle wood appearance of the wood. During maturation, the whiskey interacts with the wood, absorbing the flavors and developing complexity. The environment also plays a significant role in this stage. In Scotland, for example, cooler temperatures and higher humidity slow the aging process, allowing a more gradual development of flavors. In warmer climates like Kentucky, the heat accelerates the interaction between the spirit and the wood, causing the whiskey to age faster. As the whiskey ages, a portion of it evaporates through the barrel, known as the angel share. This can be as much as 2% of the whiskey per year. The longer it ages, the more that is lost to the angels. But what remains in the barrel becomes richer and more concentrated. The length of maturation can vary greatly depending on the style of whiskey and the distiller's goals. Some whiskeys may be ready after a few years, while others are left to mature for decades. During this time, distillers regularly sample their whiskey to ensure it's aging properly and developing the desired characteristics. Once the whiskey has reached its peak, it's ready for the final step, bottling. After years of waiting, the whiskey is finally ready to be bottled. Before this, many distillers will dilute the whiskey by adding water to bring it down to a desired proof, often between 40 and 50% alcohol by volume. Some whiskeys, however, are bottled at cask strength, meaning it retains the full intensity of the alcohol content straight from the barrel. Once bottled, the whiskey is sealed and labeled, a final mark of quality and heritage. It is now ready to make its journey from the distillery to your glass, carrying with it the flavors, craftsmanship, and the time that has gone into each drop. The perfect whiskey pour is a personal experience. Whether you prefer it neat or on the rocks or a splash of water, this is where the hard work of the farmer, distiller, copper all come together. Each sip reveals a layer of flavor, from sweetness of the grain to the simple spice of the barrel. From grain to glass, whiskey's journey is long, but each step is a testament to craftsmanship and traditions. So the next time you raise your glass, take a moment to appreciate the story that began in the fields and ended in your hand. Cheers. So let's end with a toast. Whiskey making is an art form that blends nature, science, tradition, and people. It's a process rooted in patience and precision. And in every bottle you hold the essence of time itself. Here's to the whiskey makers and to the stories that continue to unfold, grain by grain and glass by glass. Cheers, GolfCask. Cilantro.